Conor McGregor once famously said that precision beats power and timing beats speed. But what if you're not better at any of those things? What if your opponent has a considerable advantage over you in nearly every single way? What if the talent gap is so large that the chances of you out-anythinging them are almost non-existent? Well, that's when you bite down on your mouthpiece, get gritty, make it a war of attrition, make them work for every single inch, and then defeat them by sheer will, unrelenting pressure, and an absolute refusal to go out any way but winning. Like the 10 badasses we're talking about today. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and these are 10 times fighters overcame superior opponents. Number 10, Diego Sanchez versus Karo Parisyan. Vintage Diego entertainment in this one. Karo Parisyan was this judo hotshot who had won all these junior titles and was very likely headed for the Olympics. In fact, he was competing in the Olympic trials when the UFC offered him a contract, and he chose the octagon over his dreams because of the money. Besides losing to GSP, no knock there, Karo was unbeaten in the UFC and had wins over Nick Diaz and Chris Lytle. He was on his way to a welterweight title shot when he main evented a fight night against super popular Scrappy-Doo personification Diego Sanchez, who was just a year off tough. The narrative going in was about whether Diego's rough and tumble style would be any match for the slick, sophisticated Olympic-level judoka, who Rogan mentioned before walkouts was third in the world prior to entering the UFC. And his judo was ridiculous, and he did toss Diego all over the damn place. But Sanchez turned it into a fight in the mud for a knife, no matter where the bout took them. As the third round was starting, Parisyan looked like he'd been jumped and robbed. You could see the exhaustion on his face. Didn't matter who was more skilled, Diego took his soul that night and earned a UD. Despite title talks for Karo, the impressive as hell victory didn't earn Sanchez a shot. In fact, he would never compete for welterweight gold, which sucks. Number 9, Bigfoot Silva versus Alistair Overeem. What happens when you're so much better than somebody that you have zero respect for their ability to potentially end a fight, and they're able to suffer through 2 full rounds of you beating the hell out of them? You get one of the greatest comebacks in MMA history is what you get. A lot is made about the fact that Alistair Overeem took Bigfoot Silva too lightly in their fight. Even with a year off and a slightly more restrictive horse meat diet, Overeem was miles ahead of Silva. He was one of the most elite strikers to ever compete at heavyweight in the UFC. What is often lost in this fight is Silva's ability to endure through the punishment of the first 2 rounds. He was getting blasted with some really hard shots, and no wonder Overeem didn't respect him. It was like he couldn't be hit. But at the start of the third, what changed was Bigfoot pressed forward and said, "How about I just throw a bunch of fuck you at you until you drop?" He went for broke in those first 30 seconds. Sure, he was being underestimated and disrespected, but that was the entire fight. In the third, Silva didn't need better technique. It was brute force, and it worked. Number 8, Matt Brown versus Stephen Thompson. It's funny, I'm a huge fan of Wonder Boy and have been since the very start of his UFC career.
Shut the fuck up, kid.
But this was just such a satisfying victory. The setup was just too perfect. Here's this tall, handsome, squeaky clean phenom coming into his second ever UFC bout. He's undefeated, debuted with an insane KO of the night. He was unbeaten in 50+ kickboxing bouts with 5 world titles. Joe Rogan says before the fight that Thompson has the highest karate level we've ever seen in the UFC, breaking Lyoto Machida's heart. They mentioned that Firas Zahabi said that Stephen is the most elite striker he's ever had in his gym. I mean, it was one accolade after another. Did you know, Joe, that his brother-in-law is 9th degree red and black belt Carlos Machado? And then there's Matt fucking Brown. He started his fighting career via a drug-induced sense of invincibility on an hour's notice at a moose lodge. He wasn't related to any jiu-jitsu legends. His background was kicking the shit out of people and getting the shit kicked out of him. He was 13-11 going into that Thompson fight and had lost 4 of his last 6. And here's the thing, because of his experience, he did have a grappling advantage, but it was only a factor in the first round. In the second, Thompson got to display his full range of abilities, and Matt Brown just ate every bit of it like the immortal metal god that he is, and then proceeded to fuck Wonder Boy up on the feet and on the ground. He absolutely wrecked Thompson that entire fight. For the first time in his life, his talent was overcome, and he was in a real fight, and he wore every bit of it on his face afterwards. What an amazing win. I'm gonna go listen to some Pantera. Number 7, Stefan Struve versus Stipe Miocic. You wouldn't think a 7-footer would get out jabbed by a guy he had a 4.5-inch reach advantage on, but But there was a very clear talent gap between eventual greatest UFC heavyweight of all time Stipe Miocic, who was unbeaten at the time, and the very tall, very long Stefan Struve. It wasn't that the skyscraper was a bad striker either, and he had a surprisingly strong submission game, but with Miocic's D1 wrestling background and Golden Gloves experience, he was just the total package, as he would go on to prove, of course. But not on this night. The first round went exactly as you'd expect this fight to go, with the crisp and technical Miocic working over Struve, particularly to the body. There was just no rhythm that Stefan could get, but a switch flipped in the second round about halfway through, and Struve said, "Fuck it, I'm gonna make this a fight." The constant pressure was risky, as Stefan would end up rocked, but he just barreled right through it and eventually overwhelmed the future champion until the referee had seen enough and saved Miocic from a more prolonged beating. Given their bodies of work after this fight, it's one of the more shocking entries in this video, and a great example of when just biting down on your mouthpiece and going for it can negate superior skills, albeit at a very high risk. Number 6. Clay Guida versus Anthony Pettis. There couldn't have been much more hype for Anthony Pettis coming into the UFC than there was following his all-time classic bout with Benson Henderson that famously featured the legendary Showtime kick. In fact, straight from the WEC, the flashy kickboxer was meant to get a fight for the lightweight title, but unfortunately for him, Frankie Edgar and Gray Maynard had a draw that would need to be run back, and so instead he would debut against fan favorite Clay Guida. The type of fighter here couldn't be a starker contrast. Guida fought like a caveman on Adderall, and Pettis was one of the slickest strikers in the sport period, with a deceptively strong ground game from his back. In what would end up really being the formula for beating Pettis, Guida brought non-stop grappling pressure and saw the majority of the fight on top of the white-hot prospect. The only kick that Pettis threw resulted in a takedown. It was pretty much Guida from horn to horn, and he would win all 3 rounds. Now, given that Pettis was meant to fight for a title, you would think that would have gotten Clay his first and only ever shot at UFC gold, but sadly no. Instead, he would have to face Benson Henderson in a title eliminator that he would lose, never to get that close to gold ever again. Number 5. Jens Pulver versus BJ Penn 1. How much higher were the expectations of BJ Penn going into his title challenge than UFC lightweight champion Jens Pulver? Despite only having 3 professional fights, he was a big betting favorite, and the contrast between these two fighters couldn't be any sharper. Penn was the prodigy. It was built right into the name. The first American with ADCC gold, 3 UFC wins in less than 8 minutes combined, arguably the most naturally gifted fighter in history. Then there's Jens Pulver. Expectations of him from the start, absolutely zero. Had to work for every single thing he'd ever gotten in his entire life. Only ever made it out of Maple Valley because he busted his ass wrestling. And even then, the most he ever had to show for it was a JUCO All-American status for 1 season. It was the battle of hard work versus raw talent. And on that night, hard work won out. Pulver kept an unmatchable pace and pressure in every single round, no matter how effective it was. And it paid over time, as he tired out the Phenom and finished strong to earn the decision victory. One of the few times the champion retaining was an upset outcome, but there was just no chance in hell that Penn was taking that gold from Pulver on that night. Number 4. Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya. Now, just because somebody is on this list doesn't mean they're unskilled. Strickland is very skilled, but I don't think many would argue that he's a more talented fighter than Israel Adesanya by any stretch. Expectations were incredibly low for Strickland's title challenge. Adesanya was a massive favorite, nearly 7-1, and rightly so, but for moving up to 205 and losing to Jan Blachowicz, his only defeat came via Poetan finish, a loss he'd avenged in the most avenging way possible. Meanwhile, Strickland had kinda quietly, well, not quietly outside the cage, but quietly built himself back up as a title contender after that devastating loss to Pereira. With the division feeling very much cleaned out, Sean was going to get his chance at the king, but it really did feel like a formality. A first-round knockdown changed everything though, and Strickland would just pour on the pressure from that point forward and not let up a bit, taking all but a single round from Adesanya. The relentless pace completely negated any skill gap and led to one of the most shocking title upsets of all time. Number 3. Darren Elkins versus Mirsad Bektic. The level of hype over Mirsad Bektic heading into this Darren Till fight was pretty crazy in hindsight. He'd had 4 UFC fights with 4 UFC wins, but Anik talked about how people thought he could make a run at the 145 title, and the betting line reflected that. The undefeated prospect was a 7-1 favorite over Elkins, the same gap between Adesanya and Strickland. Darren had more UFC fights than Bektic had career fights. But the perception was that Miocic was better in every facet of a fight, and they weren't wrong. It would be demonstrated in the bout. Darren was a pipe fitter from Portage, Indiana that was a decent wrestler in high school and could take ungodly amounts of punishment, and that was really it. But it was his ability to endure and just keep coming no matter what that would end up being the deciding factor in his bout with this fancy pants top tier prospect. Miocic beat the brakes off Elkins in the first, showing that he was indeed better in every way. It took maybe 2 minutes for the damage to embody his nickname. I mean, his face was absolutely wrecked. This would largely continue through the third, but demolishing someone who simply will not go away is exhausting. And it allowed for Elkins, who hadn't said quit in his whole life, to find an opening and complete one of the greatest comebacks in MMA history. It is without question the highlight of Darren's career, and such a perfect embodiment of grit, winning out over a far more talented opponent. Number 2, Juliana Pena versus Amanda Nunes. When I think about the rematch between Pena and Nunes, where Amanda just utterly dominated and reclaimed her throne, I know that for most, that almost entirely negated the victory that Pena had in their first fight. And while I think all of us would agree that Nunes is a much better fighter and far more talented, on that night that they first fought, that didn't matter one bit, and that is a moment you can never take away from Pena. By the point these two finally met in the cage, it was like Strickland and Adesanya to an even bigger degree. It really felt like a formality. Pena had only had 5 fights in 5 years leading up to it, with 2 losses thrown in against Shevchenko and GDR. She had 0 momentum. This matchup felt like the UFC just needing to feed the champ anybody with a recent halfway decent win. She'd destroyed the division already. Talks of retirement were getting louder. It very much looked like GOAT business as usual in the first round, with Nunes very easily handling Pena just like she had so many other opponents. But then the craziest thing happened. Juliana came out in the second, bit down on her mouthpiece, and said, "I'm going for fucking broke." She turned it into a straight up brawl and just tore the GOAT down with shot after shot until she couldn't take it anymore and succumbed to that choke because she couldn't defend herself if she wanted to. Look, say what you will about Pena, but that performance was true grit starring Jeff Bridges. Number 1, Forrest Griffin versus Shogun Hua. The human embodiment of work over talent. The embodiment of this list is Forrest Griffin, and that is not a knock on him at all. In fact, he has said as much himself, that he's not a super talented guy. He's just a dude who will fight you tooth and nail. The greatest example of that mentality was, without question, his win over Shogun Hua, who coming into the UFC for his debut was debatably the greatest light heavyweight in the world, having come from Pride FC essentially unbeaten but for a freak injury. Why he was not slated for an immediate title fight, I truly do not know, but I would imagine the UFC thought him beating such a popular guy in Forrest would set up his title challenge against Rampage Jackson very nicely. What nobody anticipated was that Shogun would try to match Griffin's death march pace from moment 0, finding himself in a marathon that he was sprinting. Despite a lot of early success, halfway through the fight, Shogun was drowning, and Griffin didn't let up at all, grinding down the middleweight GP winner until a climactic last-second rear naked choke. God, what an incredible moment. It personified why Forrest was so popular and so dangerous. He'd prove it again in another bout that could have easily made this list when he outworked and out-strategized Rampage Jackson in his next fight to become the light heavyweight champion. What a legend. Just like the editor of this video, Luke Taylor. Please follow him on all his socials and go check out his very awesome YouTube channel. A massive thanks to our channel members. I love you all like you're my children. If you want me to adopt you as well, hit the join button. There's fun, exclusive content on the other side. Like and subscribe to be blessed by Metal God Matt Brown. Leave a comment about your favorite hard work over talent outcome. And thank you so much for watching. Have a good one, guys.